Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again for another round of Libertarian Angle.
And it's good to see you and to be joined by our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. If you're new to the Future of Freedom Foundation, come and visit us at fff.org. Richard, I came across an interesting article which I shared with you yesterday from the New York Times that talked about a drug war prosecution and conviction and sentence, but not here in the United States, but in China. The defendant, the person who was convicted and sentenced, was a Canadian citizen. And
Yes.
he was accused of transporting some kind of large quantity of drugs, methamphetamine or something like that. And he was denying that he did this. And of course, we all know about the Chinese judicial system. It's not exactly civil liberties oriented. And so he was convicted and he was given the death penalty.
Yes.
Now, I thought this article really has some fascinating ramifications for those of us here in the United States. It has ramifications with respect to the drug war, which is a war, a government program that Democrats and Republicans have been waging for many, many decades, oftentimes very fiercely. And yet now you have the Canadian government that's complaining that this is an excessively high sentence here in the drug war. So there's that interesting aspect of it, is that, you know, the ferocity by which the drug war is enforced here in the United States versus the ferocity that is being waged in a totalitarian country like China. But then there's another interesting aspect of this, and that's where the drug war meets the trade war. And we're talking about, of course, Donald Trump's trade war against China, where they've arrested the daughter of the founding principal of an electronics company and cell phone company, Huawei, in China. They've arrested her in Canada at the request of U.S. officials. She was changing planes in Vancouver, I think it was, and they essentially just kidnapped her. And they're holding her. They let her out on bond, but under strict control. She's in a hotel, but she's now being subjected to extradition proceedings to the United States to stand trial for her company's supposed violation of U.S. sanctions against Iran. You know, the U.S. of course says that its sanctions have worldwide jurisdiction, that everybody has to comply with sanctions. So the question naturally arises: are the Chinese using this drug war case as a way to punish the Chinese, or to send a message to the Chinese, if you want to play this game, we'll play it with you fine? And in the process, they've also taken 2 Canadian businessmen into custody. Not really sure what the charges are. They're kind of nebulous, sort of like a threat to national security type charge, and they're holding them. And so here you have, you know, these different government programs that are here in the United States, the drug war, and you have the trade war that the Trump administration has started against China, and all of this is sort of coming together. And so I thought this really gives us an opportunity to discuss these various programs, separate them out, and delve into the ramifications of them. What do you think?
Well, I think that was highlights, given your summary, the importance of the classical liberal libertarian emphasis on separating economic affairs from the political domain. Because in the marketplace there can be rivalries, but they're peaceful in the sense that it is against the law to use violence or fraud against a competitor. Your only weapons in the marketplace, in quote marks, is to make a better, a newer, and a less expensive product. But once you bring the government in, you bring in an element that is not supposed to be in the market arena, and that is coercion, compulsion, and the threat of it. Now, the United States government declares that it is going to sanction the Iranian government because of what it views as activities by the Iranian government in other parts of the world concerning what the U.S. calls supporting religious extremism or terrorism and so on. But then the United States government says that, as you were saying, global jurisdiction, in the sense that any company, any individual who does business with Iran and has even, as I understand it, even $1 of business at the same time in the United States, then is subject to these restrictions. In other words, if you do business in the United States, no matter how little it may be connected with foreign affairs in any way, shape, or fashion, if you do $1 of business in the United States, then your business is then subject to American restrictions on your business with third parties, and in this case, Iran. As a consequence, as I've followed it in the news, as you have, this woman was taken into custody in Canada and being held by the Canadian authorities at the request of the United States government for extradition. And how has the Chinese government responded, as you've said? Well, they too have a politicized economic system, politicized in a variety of ways, but one is, like the United States, an anti-drug war. And they use their anti-drug war with the same effect as ours, driving things underground, creating black markets, and setting up punishments that involve certainly jail time, but under the Chinese system, even the possibility of the death penalty. So to punish the Canadian government for having taken into custody this Chinese citizen at the request, as I understand it, of the U.S. government for their own extradition purposes, they have arrested several Canadian citizens under their legal system of charges of drug dealing or some other, as you were saying, that may very well involve these people having either the death sentence imposed upon them or long-term of sentences in jail. Now, as a consequence of this, the U.S. is going to have to respond in some way, even though it's Canadian citizens, because the Canadians are doing this at the United States' request. And this is just upping the ante. Now, what is behind this as well? There's the underlying tension between the United States and China concerning, as you were saying, this trade war. And that is basically the United States government, particularly the current president, saying that the Chinese treat American businesses unfairly, take advantage of their market position in the United States, and as a consequence retaliating by placing barriers on the importation of Chinese goods through higher tariffs which, by the way, the American customers and businessmen of raw materials end up paying, not like Trump things by the Chinese government or their citizens per se, and then the Chinese retaliate. All of this is a tragic comedy of errors in which once the government intervenes, whether it be drugs or sanctions because of the politics that another country in another part of the world is following, that the politicians in Washington don't like, it immediately sends off these ripple effects, chain reactions, if you will, enveloping in these spider's webs of politics and control the lives of multitudes of other people. And where does it end, other than the fact that it demonstrates that individuals, whether they're in the United States or Canada or China, do not have an arena of recognized and protected free autonomy as long as they don't do anything that is clearly a violation of another's rights. They are pawns of their political systems because the affairs of what should be the marketplace become matters of state. And as long as that continues, these types of tragedies for these individuals will go on.
Yeah, as you point out, we're really dealing with three separate programs here. We've got the drug war, we've got the trade war, and then we've got the sanctions. Now, from a libertarian standpoint, we oppose all three of those things. We oppose the drug war. We think all drugs should be legalized. We oppose sanctions against other countries. It'd be difficult for me to figure out something more immoral than targeting the innocent citizens of another country for the purpose of regime change or to achieve some kind of political end. which is, of course, what they're trying to achieve with the Iran sanctions. And then there's the trade war, which is a direct violation of the principles of the liberty of the American people. But if you take, for example, the drug war, first of all, I mean, it's interesting that the drug war is also part of this totalitarian regime in China. Now we're all taught as we're growing up that America is a free enterprise country, and thank God I'm an American because at least I know I'm free, and thank the troops for our freedom and for protecting our freedom. Yet here you have this major government program that's been at really the core of the federal government for decades, called the drug war, that is also an inherent part of the Chinese system, which everybody knows is a totalitarian communist state with omnipotent powers. And so that government program, I would suggest, is inherent to totalitarian regimes. It gives them immense power. The power to punish somebody for allegedly ingesting unapproved substances. And of course, with their judicial system over there, once they accuse a person, that's pretty much akin to conviction right there. They don't have the long tradition that we do in terms of right to counsel and right to a jury trial and so forth. So this guy that's been wrapped up there, he may be innocent, but he may not be. I mean, he may be technically have violated the law, in which case the Chinese officials are really exercising the same mindset that U.S. federal officials do. This guy was pushing drugs. These are very dangerous drugs. We're going to punish him. And this isn't the first time that they impose the death penalty for drug offenses. They've executed many people that are caught dealing with drugs. But the mindset is still the same as federal officials. Federal officials would say, well, okay, we wouldn't give the guy a death penalty, but we'll send him to prison for life or for 30 or 40 years. Like, they've got the El Chapo drug war prosecution. They're going to send that guy away for life. So the mindset is the same. And so we as libertarians should ask ourselves, what business is this of the role of the state in a totalitarian system or in a system that purports to be free? That's the United States. The people have a right to ingest whatever they want to ingest. And if you were to remove this from the jurisdiction of the federal government, you would remove a tremendous ambit of control that the government exercises over the American people, much as the Chinese regime has the ability to exercise massive amounts of control over Chinese citizens as well as Americans who happen to be traveling over there and get embroiled in this thing. Then on the sanctions, what role does government have imposing sanctions on foreign regimes? Whatever the Iranian regime does, that is not the business of the federal government. And yet, as you've mentioned in many times in programs past, they've got this central planning mindset in Washington, that they're going to plan the whole world. They see the whole world as their colony. That's the imperial mindset. So they see the rise of rivals and enemies and competitors, and they think that the federal government has a role to fix all this, to balance things out and so forth. We libertarians say this is ridiculous, that all you're doing is making life worse, not just for the Iranians, which is really killing some of them. I mean, they can't even get spare parts for planes. Planes are crashing, passenger planes are crashing because they can't even get the spare parts, and there's tremendous suffering among the Iranian people. I mean, there's no morality in that. I recall when they were killing Iraqi children in the 1990s under the Clinton administration, and Madeleine Albright made that infamous statement to 60 Minutes that the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children from the sanctions was worth it. And worth it, she meant the regime change that would get rid of Saddam. We libertarians say the federal government should not be involved in sanctions against anybody. Lift them against Iran, lift the embargo against Cuba, lift the sanctions against North Korea. And then the trade war is sort of a variation of the sanctions. It's saying, well, we don't like what you're doing over there in that country, like China. We don't like the policies, your subsidies of certain industries and so forth, or unfair trade practices. But who elected the president of the United States to be the agent for American businessmen? American businessmen can handle foreign affairs fine with respect to their businesses. If they don't like how things are operating in a foreign regime, then don't do business over there. But otherwise, leave it to American businesses to negotiate their own deals. They don't need the president to be their agent. They don't need the president to be their daddy. And as you put it, if you stop politicizing this economic activity and you separate economy and the state, the way our founders separated church and state, then all of a sudden everything changes now. Now the Chinese regime no longer has the incentive to retaliate, and they certainly have the ability, much better ability, to retaliate against American citizens than the United States has against Chinese citizens, because, like I say, they don't have any respect for civil liberties at all. But then by depoliticizing all that economic activity, the world becomes a safer and friendlier place for Americans. I mean, if I were a CEO of a major American company, the last place I'd go is to China right now. When the Canadians are holding that executive from China in custody, effective custody, waiting extradition. I mean, what businessman wants to be subjected to retaliation at the hands of a communist regime? And it would make life a lot better for the American people, both in trade terms, with no trade wars, no sanctions, and of course, no drug war.
Well, I think that, you were pointing out these parallels between what the United States government does and what the Chinese government does, which just the Chinese being more severe, a death penalty versus a life sentence. But let's sort of go to the underlying premise. What is the commonality? And the commonality is that the individual is the property of the state. You are not a free individual possessing inalienable rights to your life, liberty, your honestly acquired property, and the right of pursuit of happiness, either on your own or in free interactions and mutually agreed upon interactions with others. The government views you as its property in the sense it tells you what you can drink, what you can eat, what you can smoke, what you can inhale, who you can interact with, under what terms, for what purpose, where. And based upon this, any violation of their rules, restrictions, prohibitions, or commands results in the force of their legislation coming down upon you with dire consequences for yourself, your family, and certainly the position of your wealth and income. That is the common premise of the current American government and that of China. We call ours a free society because we elect the representatives who then introduce these legislations and restrictions. The Chinese is viewed as a dictatorship because it is a self-appointed monopoly party that seized control of China many decades ago and retains it. But whether it is elected representatives imposing these laws and decrees and acts of legislation, or whether it is a monopoly communist party in Beijing, the common premise is that the elected representative or the self-appointed dictator views you, as well as the land and the resources under their respective political jurisdictions, as their property ultimately to decide how you will be disposed of. Will you be allowed to keep a portion of your income? And if so, how much? Will you be allowed to freely have movement, both domestically or abroad? And if so, by what degree? Will you be allowed to enter into a profession, an occupation? And if so, under what rules, regulations, restrictions, licensing, and certification? And if you were to interact with other human beings, either fellow citizens or those abroad, under what terms? What type of products? How may they be produced? What prices and costs are to be incurred? What quantities may be allowed to be traded back and forth between that country's jurisdiction and the jurisdiction of another country? All of this presumes ultimately that you are a property of the state. Not much different, though institutionally obviously a different epoch and era, not much different than the image of the Lord of the Manor in medieval times, who not only owned the land and the livestock, but in a sense had as his possession the peasants who intergenerationally were his property, that he disposed of, that if he sold one of his manors to another lord, you went with the property as well as the title to the land and the livestock. And implicitly, governments still view the individuals in their jurisdiction as if they were the peasants of the Middle Ages.
Yeah, that is a fantastic point. I mean, one of the favorite books in the libertarian movement is The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich Hayek, that was published in the 1940s, where Hayek says, look, if we keep traveling this road, he was specifically referring to Great Britain and the managed or regulated economy, I think, is that we're going to end up with a serfdom society. Well, that road's been traveled. I mean, we really do live in a society where Americans are serfs. And the mindset, that's what's the real pathetic part about this, is that the mindset of the American people is a serfdom mindset. That it's only libertarians that question the notion that why is somebody putting me in jail for ingesting a substance? What gives him that moral authority to put me in jail? I mean, let's assume there's no violence at all. No murder, no rape, no stealing, no nothing. All you're doing is sitting in the privacy of your home and you're saying, I'm going to eat these brownies. They have the authority to put you in jail for that. I mean, that is an incredible thing. And now it's one thing if the person who is being subjected to this kind of tyranny says, well, I dispute your authority to do this. I will comply. You go ahead and put the handcuffs on me, but I question your authority from a moral standpoint. That's not the mindset of Americans. The mindset of Americans is, well, yeah, you caught me and you have this every right to put me in jail for what I've done. I'm a bad person. Yeah, I shouldn't have ever done this. And that's the mind of a serf. When he in his own mind believes it, he's in the subordinate position. You see it also with trade, like the embargo against Cuba. How many times do you see American businessmen saying, you don't have a right to tell me who I'm going to trade with. You don't have a right to tell me that I can't go to Havana and open up a business there if I want to. I'm a sovereign individual. I have a business that I own with my own money. You don't have the authority to tell me to do this or not. You don't ever see this except among libertarian businessmen, because it's only the libertarian that's broken free of this mindset of serfdom and the master. You see it in the income tax, where the government decides what percentage of income we're going to be permitted to keep. You know, like right now there's this debate between the Democrats and the Republicans over whether the tax rate, marginal tax rate, should be 70% or whether it should be 30%. But notice that their mindset is the government sets the percentage. So essentially what people are permitted to keep is an allowance. I mean, that's the mind of a serf. While as compared to us libertarians saying, you don't have a right to impose any income tax. You don't have a right to take people's income from them. It belongs to them. They are the ones who have produced it in the marketplace. And so I think that's one of the real disasters of the welfare warfare state, is this mindset of the serf, that he not only becomes compliant and obedient and deferential to his masters, he's grateful for it. He thinks it's freedom. He thanks them. He thanks the troops for protecting this freedom of his, when really all he's thanking them is, he's essentially saying, thank you, Caesar, for forcing me to serve you. It's such a great honor.
I don't know if you remember, I'm blanking out on the title of the movie. Maybe you will remember, Jacob. The Mel Gibson movie about the Vietnam War.
Oh, yeah, we were soldiers once, something like that.
And there's a scene in it where there's a battle scene where they're fighting the Viet Cong. Bullets are flying and everything. And one of the soldiers is mortally wounded. And as he's lying there about to die, what are his last words? I'm proud that I could die for my country. I'm proud that I could die for the king. I'm proud that I could die for the Lord of the Manor. In the Second World War, Soviet soldiers would go into battle, rushing towards the German army lines, saying, for Russia, for Stalin. On the German sides, there were people who were shouting, for Hitler. This is the mindset that you are the property of the state, including the giving up of your life. Now, there's one other aspect to this that I think that is equally invidious. Not just that people come to have this attitude, Jacob, that the state owns them, and what the state restricts them to being able to do, confines them, and so on, like you were suggesting, is that there's a huge amount of self-censorship. Let us suppose that a businessman, whether we understood all the principles that you're talking about or not, a businessman said, what is the government telling me that I can't import a product from China without this import tax? Or why can't I open a business in Cuba, for instance, your other example? He can't allow himself to say those things. The reason being that any such public defiance of the government could potentially bring down a regulatory agency, a investigation by the IRS of his past tax returns, all of which are the subliminal ways of restraining criticism and opposition. I live in a world of academia, right? I'm a professor. And I can assure you that there has increasingly emerged a self-censorship in academia because of the power of the left and the administrations going along with this about political correct things. You can't challenge it. You can't try to ridicule it. You can't question it, because who the hell knows how that's going to come down upon you in the politics of the university or college to which you belong. Now, let me say I'm at an institution that is formally a state-run institution, the Citadel. But the fact is that that type of thing, I can say, has minimally crept in to the wider, with a small p, the politics of the university community there. But at many colleges and universities around the country, with all of their government funding and all of the other things and the federal rules on this, that, and the other, you have to self-censor. Because even if you don't understand all of why you're upset about this, to challenge it brings the system potentially down upon you. And that's the businessman as well, as I was just saying. Issues, and the IRS might decide it has to do a tax audit. Raise these issues, and a regulatory agency has to reevaluate your eligibility to do business, or business in a particular way, or in a certain part of the country, interacting with certain customers and so on. Or maybe you haven't been handling your health and environmental issues correctly. Maybe we need to investigate that as well. So that is also a form of control through forced self-censorship, inhibitions, because you're afraid that the power of the state will come down on you like a ton of bricks.
That is an absolute fantastic point. You are absolutely right. That's the advantage from the standpoint of the statist of having a regulated society, that you can always get somebody whenever you want them. I've seen this in the banking profession. And when I was a lawyer, I represented a bank. And you want to see an adult person who's CEO of a bank or a vice president of a bank turn into a scared little serf. Just bring the banking examiners in. They'll make their surprise visit, and man, everybody starts quivering and quaking. And it's hard to be too critical of them, because the bank examiners have the ability to shut them down. But man, they become nice little serfs. Oh, can we get you a cup of coffee? And what can we do for you? And the idea is, please don't write me up too extensively. And that's really, I mean, look, Richard, how many businessmen, CEOs of major companies in the United States have taken a major stand, public stand, against foreign interventionism in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan? How many do you see over there making speeches saying, bring the troops home? I don't know of one. I mean, if they're out there, I don't know. I assume that there's some are out there. But, the Kochs have made a public stance on things like that. But generally speaking, you don't see that, because they know the power of the state to come down on them for tax violations, income tax violations, or regulatory violations. And now, you and I both are familiar with that organization that existed back in the 70s, the Council for Competitive Economy, where you had major businessmen across the country who were taking a stand against business regulations and the idea of business regulations. And this was a very principled group of people. I mean, they were very libertarian, purist libertarians that said the state has no role in this. They weren't just taking your standard conservative position of let's reduce regulations. They were talking about things about separating the economy and the state. And so they didn't have that serfdom mindset. You know, it's one thing to live under a system like this and then, you know, comply with it and be very obedient, deferential. It's another thing to comply with it but stand against it, make a public stand against it. And that's what these guys were doing. And you'll recall Bill Law, who was a friend of both of ours, he was from Cudahy, Wisconsin, and he had a tanning operation that, because of competition from Japan, a leather tanning business, he was going out of business. I mean, he was losing massive amounts of market share to the Japanese. And he published, I think it was an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. He was part of this group that said, do not impose tariffs, because a lot of the leather industry was saying, hey, protect us. And Law came and said, I'm losing a lot of money here. I don't know if I can survive. Do not impose tariffs. That the free society necessarily does away with tariffs and import restrictions and protectionism. I will do my best to compete, and if I'm unable to do it, then I don't deserve to be in business. I mean, that's what we need in this country, Richard. Leadership among the business community in a principled libertarian way.
The last time, to my knowledge, that there was a major segment of the business community that publicly spoke out on that and these types of foreign policy issues, specifically a war, was the Spanish-American War of 1898, when businessmen such as Andrew Carnegie, the founder and head of U.S. Steel, and others, said that this was a war that threatened the values and the traditions and the institutions of the United States in the name of old world imperialism. Now, notice we usually think of anti-war people being on the left, you know, progressives, socialists, but the fact is that was an era in which these people were more in our tradition of classical liberalism: peace, freedom, free trade, non-intervention at home and abroad. And so you'd had people of the caliber of Andrew Carnegie, who publicly gave money for the anti-war league during the Spanish-American War. We have not seen people of that character and quality representing that particular political point of view doing this for a very, very long time. Now, there have been instances, maybe some viewers and listeners would not even think about this, but there were businessmen who opposed domestic government interventionism. Now, behind me on one of these shelves, I have some old pamphlets from during and immediately after the Second World War, issued by Procter & Gamble, the well-known American corporation. And they were sponsoring leading economists, unknown mostly today, but leading free market economists, to write against Keynesian full employment policies, questioning the continuation after the war of wage and price controls. Where are those types of businessmen anymore? They're gone. When Leonard Read founded the Center for Economic Education in 1946, he had prominent businessmen on his founding board who stood to a great degree on the same philosophical principles as himself on the need for free market education against the encroachments of big government. Where are those businessmen anymore? And that is the worst thing. The longer the system goes on, the more it comes to be taken for granted, because in an intergenerational loss of a memory and a sense and the appreciation of the importance of a system different than the one you find yourself living under. When the government does everything and the market is left to do a lot less, then don't be surprised that people, for granted, presumes, well, that's just the order of things, like the rain falls from the sky, or the clouds cover the sun and make it colder. Well, government exists and controls, regulates, commands, prohibits, and insists upon. And people just come to take it for granted. That, what you were saying, people accepting it, viewing that the government has the right to, it's this growth of a belief intergenerationally, because they come to know nothing else, that the government has a right to do this, because they can't imagine the alternative in any consistent way without thinking, oh, chaos, anarchy, who will take care of this if the government doesn't? And that's a hard mindset to overcome and break.
Yeah.
It's not impossible, but it's not easy.
Yeah, especially when you've been born and raised. I mean, you know, if the transition comes, let's say after you've lived on this good earth for 30 years, it's easier to resist because you remember what life was like before the transition. But if you're born and raised under a system that has a CIA, an NSA, a giant military establishment, a drug war, a DEA, a Federal Reserve, an income tax, you sit there and you're told from the first grade on in government schools by government school teachers that this is freedom. Well, you get to hit your 30s and your 40s and you say, gosh, this is all freedom. The drug war and the Federal Reserve. Boy, I'm sure grateful I live in a free society when you've got the mind of the serf. My favorite quote, Richard, I think of all the quotes I've ever come across is Goethe's quote, because it really encapsulates what we're confronting here in the United States. I mean, it's one thing if you know you're not free and you're battling for it. Okay, you know, you're still not free, but there's some liberation in the sense that you have a grip on reality. Goethe says, none are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free. Because if you falsely believe you're free, you have no incentive to break the chains. You're grateful for your chains because you think they're freedom. Finally, you reminded me of a guy. Do you remember that guy? I think he was the head of Sears and Roebuck during the New Deal when we were transitioning to a welfare state regulated economy. Was that the guy that was carried out of his building on a great big chair or something?
Right. What it was, I'm forgetting. In fact, I was just watching a documentary on the Smithsonian Channel on TV where they were talking about, you know, the decade of the 1930s, decade of the 1940s, now colorized, you know, America's history in color, with the old, movie footages of that era. And there was some type of a dispute where this guy wouldn't follow a regulation. It was a department store owner. I'm forgetting which one. Maybe you're right. And they literally had to take him out. The federal government marshals had to remove him from his office in his chair because he wouldn't go along with some government edict. I think it had to do with his company accepting federally imposed terms about a labor contract or something like that. I think it was during the Second World War. But yes, you watch him. He's like this. He's in his chair from his executive office desk, and they're carrying him out. So yes, those days are long gone.
All right. On that note, we need to wrap things up. We're out of time. So enjoyed the conversation with you, Richard, as always, and I want to thank our viewers for tuning in. You can get more of this pure principled libertarian case for the free society at fff.org. And Richard, I look forward to seeing you next week.
Until next time, and thanks to the viewers and listeners for sharing their time with us.